The son, having made a commendable effort to appear for the Greystone Manor annual open day, seemed to have concluded that its duty was done. It now shone with the apologetic warmth of a guest who has arrived too early for a party and is unsure what to do with his hands. Nevertheless, it was a fine enough afternoon for the citizens of Flaxborough to perform their yearly pilgrimage in aid of the St. Jude's Church Roof Fund, a fund whose perilous state was as much a local institution as the leaky roof itself. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, mistress of Greystone Manor and custodian of its considerable legacy, stood on the terrace overlooking her lawn. The lawn, a vast and intimidating expanse of green, was dotted with the town's more respectable elements, who navigated it with the careful, purposeless air of chess pieces awaiting a player. Mrs. Vance did not mingle. She presided. Her posture suggested that she was personally holding the manor upright through sheer force of will. "Do try one of the fruit scones, Councillor," she said, her voice carrying across the teacups with the precision of a well-aimed dart. "My Mrs. Higgins is a treasure, but she becomes quite despondent if her efforts are not properly appreciated." Councillor Ormside, a man whose chief civic contribution was to occupy space on committees, took a scone with the reluctance of someone accepting a summons. To his left, Mr. Alistair Finch, chairman of the Flaxborough Historical Society, made a small appreciative noise. "A triumph as always, Eleanor. Much like the gardens." He cast a look at the rose bushes that was less admiring than proprietary, as if he were mentally cataloguing them for a future acquisition. The main attraction of the open day, besides the implied social obligation and the undeniable quality of the scones, was the tour of the manor's ground floor. This culminated, as it always did, in the long gallery, a corridor of chilly grandeur where the collected ancestors of the Greystone family stared down from their frames with varying degrees of disapproval. The undisputed centerpiece of this collection was the portrait of Lady Beatrice Greystone, Eleanor Vance's late aunt and the family's last true matriarch. Lady Beatrice had been a woman, it was said, who could curdle milk with a single glance, and had once caused a visiting politician to forget his own name merely by raising an eyebrow. The portrait captured this quality perfectly. The artist had rendered her seated bolt upright, her hands clasped in her lap, as if wringing the neck of some invisible, impertinent subordinate. Her eyes followed you down the gallery, not with the clever trickery of perspective, but with what felt like genuine, posthumous judgment. It was young Timothy, the 7-year-old son of the town solicitor, who saw it first. Children possessing a lamentable lack of social grace are often the first to point out that the emperor is not only naked but has also made a rather unfortunate sartorial choice. "Mummy," he said, his voice piercing the reverential hush of the gallery. "Why is the scary lady wearing glasses?" His mother, a woman who lived in mortal terror of causing a scene, made a shushing noise that was louder than her son's original comment. But it was too late. Heads turned. A low, collective murmur, like the sound of a slow puncture in the tire of public decorum, began to spread. Mr. Finch, who had been holding forth on the subject of 17th-century varnish, stopped mid-sentence and adjusted his own spectacles. He peered at the portrait, blinked, and then peered again. The others followed his gaze. There, on the severe, unyielding face of Lady Beatrice Greystone, sat a pair of perfectly rendered wire-rimmed spectacles. They were not crudely daubed on. On the contrary, they had been painted with a steady, delicate hand, the light catching one of the lenses with an air of almost academic precision. The effect was not one of vandalism so much as of unauthorized posthumous prescription. The formidable matriarch had been transformed into a rather stern, disapproving librarian. The silence that followed was of a unique and profound quality, the sort of silence that usually precedes either a declaration of war or the announcement of the winner of the best Victoria sponge. Mrs. Eleanor Vance swept into the gallery. Her progress was less a walk and more a stately advance, parting the sea of her guests as she went. She stopped before the portrait of her aunt. She did not gasp. She did not exclaim. Her face simply hardened, its expression settling into something that might have been achieved with quick-setting cement. For a full 10 seconds, she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the optical edition. "Filbert," she said finally, her voice dangerously calm, addressing the air where her butler would shortly materialize. Mr. Filbert, who had served the family for 40 years and had the uncanny ability to appear before he was summoned, was already there. "Madame, the gallery is now closed," she announced to the room. "Please show our guests back to the terrace. The police will be notified." The word police hung in the air, a vulgarity in this temple of genteel tradition. It was not a crime one could imagine being investigated by men in large boots. It was an affront to history, a slight against propriety, a deeply personal and exquisitely calculated insult. As the guests were ushered out, their faces a mixture of shock and illicit thrill, they began to whisper. And in Flaxborough, a whisper, given the right conditions, could achieve the force of a gale. Inspector Pubright, they murmured, would have to be called. This was most certainly a matter for him. The guests departed Greystone Manor not in a disorderly flood, but with the pained, self-conscious dignity of a congregation that has just sat through a sermon of baffling heresy. Conversation, which had flowed like lukewarm tea only moments before, was now reduced to a series of strained pleasantries at the gate, each freighted with unspoken meaning. Once clear of the long gravel drive, however, this dam of civility broke. Small groups splintered off, heading for the various social reservoirs of Flaxborough, where such a potent vintage of gossip could be decanted, savoured, and analysed. The chalice tea rooms, a sanctuary of chintz and tiered cake stands, received the first and most detailed accounts. Mrs. Hemstock, the proprietor, had the ears of a bat and the discretion of a town crier. She moved between tables, refilling pots of Earl Grey, her face a mask of professional neutrality that concealed an archivist's zeal for local scandal. "Utterly brazen," declared Mrs. Parsons, the solicitor's wife, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that carried to the farthest corners of the room, right under Eleanor Vance's nose. "And her composure." My dear, it was terrifying, pure ice. Not a flicker. Miss Agnes Petherbridge, seated alone by the window, stirred her tea with a slow, deliberate motion. As a retired art teacher, her opinion was considered definitive on matters of pigment and profanity. The brushwork was surprisingly competent. She offered, to no one in particular, though everyone was listening. A steady hand, lacking in flair, of course. More the work of a sign writer than an artist. This was delivered with the quiet satisfaction of an expert delivering a verdict that subtly damned all parties involved, including, it was implied, the original artist. The conversation swirled around the central question: who and why? It was agreed that it was not the work of a common hooligan. A hooligan would have used a spray can or, at the very least, slashed the canvas. This was something different. It was precise. It was personal. It was, in its own quiet way, far more insulting. Meanwhile, at the Blue Boar, the incident was being subjected to a more robust masculine analysis over pints of bitter. Here, the social nuances were stripped away, leaving the bare bones of motive and opportunity. "It's that nephew," stated Councillor Ormside, wiping foam from his lip with the back of his hand. He spoke with the unshakable certainty of a man for whom all complex problems have simple, incorrect solutions. Young Julian, the so-called artist, lives off his aunt's charity and resents every penny. Heard they had a terrible row only last week. This theory found fertile ground. Julian Vance was a known quantity in Flaxborough. He wore corduroy jackets, smoked French cigarettes, and had once tried to pay his bar tab with a small, incomprehensible watercolour sketch. In a town that valued predictability above all other virtues, such behaviour was tantamount to a confession. "Stands to reason," agreed Mr. Grout, the ironmonger. Got the artist's materials, hasn't he? Sneaks in, quick dab of paint, and off he goes. A protest, you see. What precisely was being protested remained unclear, but the idea was too neat to be discarded. Within the hour, Julian Vance had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. The story, in its retelling, acquired new and exciting details. The spectacles in the Chalice tea rooms, a minor wire-rimmed affair, had become, by the third pint at the Blue Boar, a pair of garish, thick-rimmed monstrosities, possibly luminous. The quiet act of painting was now a drunken escapade, a bohemian's two-fingered salute to the establishment. By the time the evening papers were being prepared, the defacement of Lady Beatrice's portrait had been elevated from a peculiar prank to a full-blown assault on the memory of Flaxborough's most formidable citizen. It was a symptom of modern decay, a sign that the old standards were crumbling, and as the last of the light faded from the sky, a single thought settled over the tea rooms and the public houses alike. This was no ordinary case for a constable to handle with a notebook and a heavy tread. This required a certain touch. This, everyone agreed, was a matter for Inspector Pubright. Inspector Purbright's car, a vehicle of profound and unassuming character, made its way up the Greystone Manor drive with none of the urgency befitting a police investigation. It seemed to absorb the gravel rather than crunch it, its progress quiet and respectful. Beside him, Sergeant Sid Love sat with a notebook on his knee, his pen poised. Sergeant Love believed in the tangible evidence of ink on paper. It anchored him in a world that his superior often seemed to view from a disconcerting, philosophical distance. They were met at the grand oak door, not by the agitated lady of the house, but by the butler, Mr. Filbert. He was a tall, desiccated man who appeared to have been constructed entirely from straight lines and formal phrases. There was no flicker of surprise or alarm in his eyes. He looked upon the arrival of the police as he might the delivery of a parcel, an event to be processed with minimal fuss and entered into the day's ledger. "Inspector Pubright," he inquired, though it was not a question. "Mrs. Vance is expecting you in the morning room." He led them across a hall of polished flagstones, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. It was a house built to impress, to remind visitors of their relative insignificance in the grand scheme of the Greystone lineage. Pubright took it in with a mild, almost pastoral interest, his gaze lingering for a moment on a suit of armour that stood sentinel by the staircase. Looking faintly embarrassed by its own redundancy, Mrs. Eleanor Vance was arranged in a wing-backed chair, a porcelain cup and saucer resting untouched on a table beside her. The earlier public mask of icy control had been replaced by a more refined private fury. It radiated from her in small, controlled waves. "Inspector," she began, dispensing with preamble, "I trust Filbert has informed you of the situation. An act of puerile, malicious vandalism has been committed." Pubright inclined his head. "I have been given the broad strokes, Mrs. Vance. Perhaps you could furnish them with a little detail." He took the seat opposite her, a simple, unobtrusive presence. Sergeant Love remained standing by the door, a solid and official bookend to the scene. "Detail?" Mrs. Vance's laugh was a brittle thing. "The detail is plain to see. Someone entered my house, Inspector, during a charity event for the church, and saw fit to deface a priceless family heirloom, a portrait of my aunt, Lady Beatrice. The name was spoken with a reverence that bordered on the liturgical. They painted spectacles on her. She said the last word, as one might say, vermin." "Had the gallery been open to the public all day?" Pubright asked, his tone one of gentle curiosity. "From 2 o'clock, as is traditional. Guests are permitted to circulate freely on the ground floor. We have never," she added, a sharp edge to her voice, "had cause to regret that trust until today. And you have no idea who might be responsible?" Here Mrs. Vance paused. She picked up her teacup, looked into it as if consulting an oracle, and placed it back in its saucer with a decisive click. "I do not deal in speculation, Inspector. I deal in facts. And the fact is, my nephew Julian was here this afternoon. He and I had a disagreement earlier this week regarding his finances, or rather his lack thereof. Your nephew is an artist, I believe? Purbright's question was soft, almost an afterthought. He calls himself one. He produces canvases with paint on them, if that is the current definition. He has the temperament, Inspector. He is emotional, volatile. He considers tradition and legacy to be obstacles to his self-expression. She sculpted the last two words from the air with disdain. This is precisely the sort of pathetic, symbolic gesture he would mistake for wit. She continued for several minutes, her monologue a finely crafted tapestry of grievance and insinuation. Pubright listened with an air of courteous patience, his gaze never leaving her face. He did not take notes. He simply absorbed the words, the tone, the carefully chosen poisons in her phrases. Sergeant Love's pen, however, scratched away dutifully, capturing the name Julian Vance and underlining it twice. When she had finally wound down, a silence settled in the room. Pubright allowed it to remain for a moment before speaking. "May we see the portrait now, Mrs. Vance?" She led them back into the echoing hall and down the long gallery. The portraits of Greystone's past stared down, their painted eyes seeming to follow the little procession with silent condemnation. And there at the end was Lady Beatrice. The spectacles were, as Miss Petherbridge had observed, competently done. They sat on the bridge of her formidable nose with an unnerving plausibility. They did not mock the woman so much as alter her, reframing her formidable power as something more bureaucratic and fussy. It was an act of profound subversion. Pubright stood before the painting for a full minute, his hands clasped behind his back. Sergeant Love beside him shifted his weight. "A childish prank, sir," Love murmured, keeping his voice low. "But malicious. Done to get a rise out of the aunt, I'd wager. The nephew seems the likely candidate." Inspector Pubright made a small, non-committal sound in his throat. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowed not on the spectacles themselves, but on the infinitesimal space where the new paint met the old varnish. "Perhaps, Sergeant," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Perhaps, but it's a very particular kind of child, wouldn't you say, who takes such care to get the perspective just right?" By the following morning, the theory of Julian Vance's culpability had completed its journey from idle speculation to established fact in the collective mind of Flaxborough. It had been endorsed over breakfast tables and ratified in the queue at the baker's. All that was required was for the police to complete the necessary paperwork. At the police station, Sergeant Love laid out the case for Inspector Pubright with the satisfaction of a man presenting a perfectly assembled model kit. Motive. The argument with his aunt, "Miss Vance over money." "Clear as day," he began, ticking off the points on his fingers. "Means he's an artist, sir, or calls himself one. Plenty of paint lying about, I've no doubt. Opportunity. He was present at the event. Admitted as much by Mrs. Vance herself. And temperament." Love paused, searching for the right word. "He's the type, artistic, rebellious, doesn't hold with the old ways." Pubright, who was contemplating a fly that was attempting a daring reconnaissance of the station's ceiling, nodded slowly. "A very neat summary, Sergeant. It has the virtue of simplicity." "The Chief Constable seems to think so, sir," Love added, playing his trump card. "Councillor Ormside telephoned him personally this morning to offer the Council's full support in prosecuting the matter swiftly. Ormside seems to think it's a clear-cut case of malicious mischief with intent to cause distress to a prominent citizen." "I'm sure he does," Pubright said mildly. "Prominent citizens in distress are a councillor's bread and butter. I suppose we ought to have a word with Mr. Vance." Julian Vance's studio was located above a bakery, a position that ensured the scent of turpentine was perpetually at war with the aroma of rising dough. The room was a study in calculated chaos. Canvases were stacked against every wall. Tubes of paint lay uncapped on plates, and a collection of wine bottles stood clustered in a corner like guilty conspirators. Julian himself, a young man with a great deal of dark hair and a carefully cultivated expression of weary genius, met them at the door. He was wearing a shirt with a prominent daub of crimson paint on the sleeve, a detail Sergeant Love noted with grim satisfaction. "Inspector," Julian said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "to what do I owe the honour? Has my aunt accused me of stealing the family silver, or is this about something new?" "We're making inquiries," Pubright said, his voice placid, "about an incident at the manor yesterday, concerning the portrait of Lady Beatrice Greystone." Julian leaned against the doorframe. "Ah, yes, the spectral spectacles. I heard about that. A masterful stroke of subversive wit, don't you think? Undermines the entire cult of ancestor worship my aunt so cherishes." "I wish I'd thought of it myself," Sergeant Love bristled. "Can you account for your movements yesterday afternoon, Mr. Vance? Specifically between 2 and 4 o'clock? Account for my movements?" Julian seemed to find the question deeply amusing. "I am an artist, Sergeant, not a railway timetable." "I wonder," I absorbed. "I might have been communing with a particularly interesting cloud formation over the fens. I might have been contemplating the existential despair of a discarded crisp packet. I certainly wasn't clocking in and out." "So you have no alibi," Love stated, his voice flat. "If you wish to put it in such dreary, prosaic terms, then no, I have no alibi," Julian retorted, his amusement curdling into irritation. Pubright, who had been quietly observing a half-finished painting of a bleak, featureless landscape, finally spoke. "Your aunt seems convinced you are responsible, Mr. Vance. She feels the act was a message directed at her." "Everything is a message directed at her," Julian scoffed. "If a pigeon soils her windscreen, it's a personal slight from the entire avian community. Of course she blames me. I am her favourite project, the unruly nephew. It gives her purpose." He gestured around the messy studio. "Do you see any spectacles here, Inspector? Any secret plans for the defacement of provincial portraiture?" "No, because I have better things to do. My own work, for a start." The interview concluded a few minutes later, having yielded nothing but an increase in mutual antipathy. As they walked back to the car, Sergeant Love was practically vibrating with conviction. No alibi. A clear motive. He practically admitted he enjoyed the crime. He's arrogant, uncooperative. "It's him, sir. Open and shut." Pubright opened the passenger door for the sergeant before walking around to his own side. He started the engine, the quiet rumble seeming to absorb the morning's certainties. "He's certainly a very obvious young man, Sergeant," he said, pulling away from the curb. "And there is nothing in this world quite so useful to a guilty party as an obvious suspect." While Sergeant Love spent the afternoon compiling a meticulous and damning report on the character and movements of Julian Vance, Inspector Pubright found himself occupied by less conclusive thoughts. The case, which to everyone else seemed to be closing like a well-oiled hinge, felt to him like a door that had been left slightly, irritatingly, ajar. The problem was not the grand architecture of the motive or the solid pillar of opportunity, but something much smaller. It was the paint. He left the station and took a walk towards the market square, his pace unhurried. An artist like Julian Vance, particularly one so disdainful of convention, would have his own tools, his own palette. He would use oils, perhaps acrylics, pigments with which he was familiar. An act of rebellion to be authentic must at least be committed with one's own materials. To go out and purchase a special pot of paint for a brief, impulsive act of vandalism seemed both inefficient and out of character. His walk led him, as if by accident, to the door of Grout's Ironmongery, a shop whose interior had remained unchanged since the invention of the screw. Mr. Grout himself, a man built along the sturdy lines of a cast-iron stove, was busy arranging brass fittings in a series of tiny wooden drawers. "Inspector," he said, his tone a mixture of respect for the office and the familiarity of a fellow citizen. "Come about that business at the manor, I expect." "A shocking affair," Young scamp wants a good talking to. All in due course, Mr. Grout, Pubright said pleasantly. Actually, I'm here on a personal matter. I'm looking for a particular kind of paint. A small tin. An enamel. Mr. Grout's professional pride was engaged. Enamel, eh? For what purpose, if I might ask? Radiator, skirting board, model boat. Something more delicate, Pubright mused. The sort of thing one might use to touch up a garden gnome, perhaps. Something that dries hard, with a bit of a sheen, but not too glossy. Ah, said Grout, with the satisfaction of a master diagnostician. You'll be wanting a pot of Finlow's Hobby enamel, the best there is. Dries quick as a flash and tough as old boots. Got a whole rack of them. What colour were you after? I was thinking of a plain black, Pubright said. Mr. Grout retrieved a tiny tin from a display stand and placed it on the counter. Pubright picked it up. He loosened the lid with a coin from his pocket and peered inside. The dark, viscous liquid had a sharp, distinctive chemical smell. The sheen was exactly as he remembered from the thin lines painted on Lady Beatrice's face. It was the paint of a hobbyist, a tinkerer, a careful amateur. It was not the paint of an artist. Young Vance wouldn't be buying this stuff, I can tell you that, Grout continued, leaning on the counter. He gets his supplies sent down from London. Great crates of it. Foreign-sounding names. Not good, honest English paint like this. Indeed, Pubright said, carefully replacing the lid. Thank you, Mr. Grout. You've been most helpful. He paid for the small tin and left the shop. The second nagging detail returned to him as he stood on the pavement. The design of the spectacles themselves. They were not fashionable. They were not the sort of ironic, oversized frames a young man like Julian would choose for a prank. They were delicate, functional, almost austere. They were the sort of spectacles one might have seen on a headmistress or a civil servant 40 years ago. They were, Pubright reflected, a piece of history in their own right. The obvious conclusion, so beloved of the chief constable and the town gossips, was beginning to look rather less obvious. The crime had been committed with the wrong paint and in the wrong style. It was as if someone had set out to write a piece of inflammatory graffiti and had done so using perfect, old-fashioned copperplate script. The message and the medium were at war with each other. And in that quiet contradiction, Inspector Pubright sensed the case was only just beginning. If Inspector Purbright's quiet dismissal of the obvious had unsettled Sergeant Love, he did not show it. He merely filed his report on Julian Vance under pending and awaited further instruction. He did not have to wait long. Having concluded that the crime was committed with the wrong materials, Pubright decided it was time to inquire after people who might possess the right motives. This required widening the circle of inquiry beyond angry young men to include the more subtly complex world of respectable, middle-aged citizens with long memories and carefully tended grievances. His first port of call was the Flaxborough Historical Society, an institution housed in a building that seemed to be actively surrendering to the forces of gravity and damp. Its chairman, Mr. Alistair Finch, greeted the inspector with an air of fussy importance, as if Pubright were a visiting dignitary come to inspect his small, dusty kingdom. "Inspector, welcome," he said, gesturing expansively at a glass case containing 3 Roman coins and what appeared to be a fossilized biscuit. "A sad business that brings you here. A very sad business indeed. An attack on the portrait is an attack on the town's very heritage." "I was hoping you might help me understand that heritage a little better, Mr. Finch," Pubright said, his tone one of deferential inquiry. "Mrs. Vance is naturally distressed, but the painting is, in a sense, a public figure." Finch's expression tightened. "In a sense, yes, though it is kept in a distinctly private collection. I have made overtures to Eleanor for years, Inspector, arguing that the portrait belongs in a public museum, under professional care, where it can be properly secured and appreciated by all." His gaze drifted around his own museum, and for a moment a flicker of grand ambition seemed to warm the chilly air. The Finch wing, Home of the Greystone collection. You feel it's not safe at the manor? Pubright asked gently. I feel that private ownership carries inherent risks, Finch corrected himself, retreating into officialdom. Things can be misplaced, damaged, altered, as we have seen. When one individual has absolute control over a piece of public history, it is a great and terrible responsibility. Not everyone, he added with a sigh of profound meaning, is equal to it. You were at the open day, of course. Naturally, I make a point of it every year. Keep an eye on the condition of the collection. He lowered his voice. I was examining the portrait not half an hour before the discovery. The light in that gallery is quite dreadful. Causes the varnish to yellow. He shook his head at the thought of such curatorial neglect. Then I was called away to the terrace to advise Councillor Ormside on the historical precedent for church roof repairs. By the time I returned, the deed had been done. He had a solid, verifiable alibi for the crucial period, delivered with an air of faint regret. Purbright's next visit was to a small, immaculate cottage on the edge of town, a house whose garden looked as if it were trimmed with nail scissors and a spirit level. This was the home of Miss Agnes Petherbridge, the retired art teacher. She received him in a sitting room filled with pale watercolours and the scent of beeswax. Inspector, she said, her voice as crisp as a starched collar. I do hope you are not here to suggest I had anything to do with that vulgar little spectacle at the manor. I am here to seek your expert opinion, Miss Petherbridge, Pubright replied smoothly, which was, in its way, the truth. You taught Julian Vance, I believe. A thin, knowing smile touched her lips. I attempted to. Julian possesses a certain raw ability, but he is cursed with the artistic temperament. All mood and no method. If Julian had attacked that painting, Inspector, it would have been a frenzied, passionate mess, a slash of viridian green across the face. He would not have had the patience or the precision for those neat, fiddly little spectacles. It is not his style at all. The work was that of a pedant, not a rebel. And the paint? As I believe I remarked in the tea rooms, it was common enamel. Utterly unsuitable. It has no depth, no life. It simply sits on the surface like a cheap lie. She looked at Pubright with sharp, intelligent eyes. You are not convinced it was the boy, are you, Inspector? The evidence is contradictory, Pubright admitted. Of course it is. She seemed pleased. You should be looking for someone with a motive, not of passionate rage, but of quiet correction. Someone with a grievance. Flaxborough is built on a bedrock of quiet grievances, like the annual flower show, Pubright asked, his tone innocent. The change in her demeanour was almost imperceptible, a slight cooling of the atmosphere, a stiffening in her posture. For the past 3 years, Miss Petherbridge's prize-winning roses had been beaten into second place by the roses from the Greystone Manor gardens. The judges, she said, her voice now clipped and precise, have their own criteria. I do not pretend to understand them. Mrs. Vance has an excellent gardener, and, shall we say, a forceful personality. Some find that combination very persuasive. She stood up, signalling the end of the interview. As Pubright made his way to the door, she offered one final parting observation. Do you know what always struck me about that portrait, Inspector? The arrogance of it, the sheer, unflinching certainty in her eyes. Lady Beatrice was a formidable woman, but she was human. She had her vanities, her weaknesses like anyone else. But Eleanor Vance has curated her memory into something monolithic, untouchable. It is a terrible thing to have one's humanity erased in the name of posterity. Driving back to the station, Pubright considered his 2 new interviews. He had spoken to a man who coveted the painting and a woman who competed fiercely with its owner. Both had opportunity, and both possessed motives that were, in the small, intense world of Flaxborough, more than powerful enough for a quiet act of revenge. The simple case of the rebellious nephew had dissolved, replaced by a far more delicate and complex picture. For 2 days, Flaxborough held its breath. waiting for the inevitable hand of the law to descend upon Julian Vance's paint-splattered collar. But no arrest was made. The initial fever of speculation cooled to a low, simmering curiosity. The bespectacled portrait of Lady Beatrice, having provided a thrilling jolt to the town's placid rhythm, was now in danger of becoming yesterday's news, a mere anecdote to be trotted out at future sherry parties. It was at this delicate moment, when the affair risked dying from a simple lack of development, that a second, even more peculiar event occurred. The Morning Post brought a plain brown envelope to the Flaxborough Historical Society. The address was typewritten, the stamp was common, and the postmark was unmistakably local. Mr. Alastair Finch, who opened the Society's mail himself in a daily ritual of hope over experience, slit the envelope with his thumb. He had been expecting a bill from the electricity board or perhaps a pamphlet on archival quality mothballs. He was not expecting what he found inside. The first item was a small, neat bundle of banknotes held together with a paperclip. He counted it twice. It was £30. To a man accustomed to running a museum on a budget that made a church mouse look profligate, this was a significant windfall. The second item was a small slip of paper cut from a larger sheet. On it were typed 6 words, a contribution towards helping our town see its history more clearly. Mr. Finch read the note 3 times. He looked at the money. He looked back at the note. His first reaction was one of gratified pride. It was an anonymous benefactor, a secret admirer of his tireless work. Then the full implication of the words began to dawn on him. See its history more clearly. The phrasing was too pointed, too specific to be a coincidence. He placed the money and the note back in the envelope with the reverence of an archaeologist handling a sacred tablet, and marched directly to the police station. He was shown into Inspector Purbright's office, where he presented the evidence with a flourish. "Inspector," he announced, his voice vibrating with importance, "there has been a development, a most significant one." Purbright took the envelope and examined its contents. Sergeant Love, standing nearby, peered over his shoulder. Purbright read the note, then placed it on his desk blotter. He looked at the money without touching it. "Clearly," Finch continued, taking the inspector's silence as an invitation to elaborate, "this is connected to the deplorable incident at the manor. The language is unmistakable. This is the act of someone who understands the deeper issues at play here. Someone who appreciates that our town's heritage should be more visible, more accessible. And you believe this person is the same one who painted the spectacles?" Purbright asked. "It seems the only logical conclusion. But the motive, you see, is what is so fascinating. It is not vandalism for its own sake. It is a statement, a critique of the privatization of our shared culture. This money, this is an act of conscience. Perhaps the culprit feels some remorse for the method, but not for the message." Finch was warming to his theme, his initial bewilderment transforming into a grand, overarching theory that conveniently placed his own museum at the center of the drama. Purbright listened to all of this with courteous attention. When Finch had finally exhausted his analysis, the inspector thanked him for his promptness and public-spiritedness. He assured him the evidence would be examined and showed him to the door. When he was gone, a heavy silence filled the office. Sergeant Love was the first to speak. "Well, that muddies the waters." "Does it, Sergeant?" Purbright was looking at the small, typed note. "Or does it perhaps clarify them?" "It doesn't seem like the sort of thing Julian Vance would do," Love conceded. "He's all about grand, empty gestures. This is quiet. And it involves giving money away, which doesn't seem to be his style at all." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "Our vandal has become a philanthropist, a patron of the historical arts. The crime had fundamentally changed its character. What had begun as a seemingly personal insult, an act of familial spite, now wore the baffling disguise of a civic-minded campaign. It was no longer about humiliating Mrs. Eleanor Vance. It was about educating the town of Flaxborough, The spectacles on the portrait were not a punchline, but a punctuation mark in a sentence that was still being written. Pubright picked up the typed note between his thumb and forefinger, holding it as if weighing its meaning. The case had become less about who had a grudge and more about who had a mission. And in a town like Flaxborough, a mission could be a far more dangerous thing. The police station grew quiet as the afternoon bled into evening. Sergeant Love, his duty to Julian Vance's file thoroughly discharged, had departed with a final, baffled shake of his head over the anonymous donation. Pubright remained in his office, the window open to the cooling air, the sounds of Flaxborough winding down for the day drifting in. On his desk, the three key pieces of the puzzle lay like relics of opposing faiths, the file on Julian representing the doctrine of the obvious, the small tin of black enamel, a testament to the methods of the careful amateur, and the typed note, a scripture for a new and baffling creed. Pubright contemplated them not as a policeman weighing evidence, but as a naturalist observing the peculiar habits of a very specific species, the small-town human. He had long ago concluded that the most ferocious passions were seldom wasted on grand ideals like love or justice. They were reserved for the far more serious matters of reputation, precedence, and memory. And this case, he now felt certain, was entirely about memory. It was not, he mused, a crime against Mrs. Eleanor Vance or even against the long-dead Lady Beatrice. It was a crime against an idea, the carefully constructed, fiercely guarded idea of Greystone Manor, and all it represented. Mrs. Vance was not merely the lady of the house. She was the high priestess of a cult whose sole deity was her formidable aunt. She had spent years polishing the legend, sanding away any human imperfections until what remained was a monolithic icon of severity and strength. The portrait was the public face of this legend, a two-dimensional statement of unflawed ancestry, and into this temple of perfection someone had quietly entered and placed a pair of spectacles on the idol. It was not a destructive act. It was an editorial one. It was a footnote added to a history that had been declared complete. Pubright picked up the file on Julian Vance and set it aside. The boy's motive was personal, and his style would have been loud. This crime was neither. He then considered the others. Alistair Finch saw the portrait as a public asset, a historical document. He resented Mrs. Vance's private ownership of the town's narrative. His motive would be to reclaim history for the public good, or at least for his version of it. Miss Agnes Petherbridge, with her talk of pedantry and quiet correction, saw the portrait as an artistic and historical lie. Her rivalry with Mrs. Vance was one of standards, of taste, of whose roses and whose version of the past was superior. Her motive would be to inject a dose of what she considered to be the truth. They were all, in their own way, fighting over the ghost of Lady Beatrice. They were struggling for control of her story. The past in Flaxborough was not a peaceful country. It was a territory under constant, polite, but ruthless occupation. The crime was not therefore an act of disrespect. Pubright suspected it was precisely the opposite. It was a strange, meticulous, and deeply eccentric act of loyalty. The culprit was not loyal to the iron-willed legend curated by Mrs. Vance, but to a more complicated, more human woman, one who perhaps had needed a little help, in her later years, to see. The spectacles were not an insult. They were a restoration. He looked again at the typed note, a contribution towards helping our town see its history more clearly. He finally understood. The author's intention was entirely literal. The question was no longer simply who, but what secret were they so determined to bring into focus? Having understood the nature of the crime, Inspector Pubright now faced the more delicate task of identifying its author. A direct approach was out of the question. It would be like trying to catch a moth with a sledgehammer. What was needed was a catalyst, a small, carefully applied pressure that would cause the truth to reveal itself. He decided, therefore, to host a meeting. The official pretext was a discussion concerning the security of public and private art collections in Flaxborough, a topic of sudden and urgent relevance. The invitations delivered by a uniformed constable were phrased as a request for the advice of prominent citizens. No one felt they could possibly refuse. They gathered in a small, seldom-used committee room at the town hall, a chamber of dark wood panelling and faded municipal portraits that smelled faintly of old paper and lost arguments. Pubright had arranged for a tray of tea and biscuits to be provided, a gesture that immediately lowered the affair from the level of a police inquiry to that of a parish council subcommittee. Mrs. Eleanor Vance sat ramrod straight, her posture a silent protest against the indignity of the surroundings and the company. Opposite her, Alistair Finch looked pleased to be consulted, his hands clasped over his waistcoat, as if preparing to deliver a lengthy speech. Miss Agnes Petherbridge, calm and observant, sat slightly apart, while Julian Vance, who had been persuaded to attend as an artistic consultant, slouched in his chair with an air of profound boredom, a study in youthful disaffection. Sergeant Love stood by the door, his notebook ready, but his expression one of deep mystification. Pubright began with a few soothing bureaucratic remarks. He thanked them for their time. He spoke of recent events and the need for a coordinated response. He invited Mr. Finch to share his thoughts on archival security, which Finch did at some length, before steering the conversation with quiet deliberation towards the specifics of the Greystone Manor incident. From a procedural standpoint, it is always helpful to understand the methods of the perpetrator, Pubright said, pouring a cup of tea for Mrs. Vance. It helps in preventing a recurrence. The materials used, for example, were quite interesting. He paused, letting the statement settle. One might have assumed an artist's oils would be employed. He gave a brief, neutral glance towards Julian, who rolled his eyes. But that was not the case. Our culprit used a common hobbyist's enamel, Finlow's brand, I believe. Very durable. It dries almost instantly. The sort of paint one could purchase for a few shillings at any ironmonger's. He delivered this information with no particular emphasis, as if sharing a mildly interesting fact from a technical journal. Julian scoffed quietly. Ghastly stuff. No subtlety. Miss Petherbridge nodded in agreement. Entirely without merit for serious work. Mr. Finch looked thoughtful, as if considering whether his museum's display cases could benefit from a new coat of paint. Mrs. Vance simply looked disgusted, as if the phrase ironmongers had physically soiled the air in the room. Pubright allowed the subject of the paint to drift, moving on to the image itself. And then there was the execution, he continued, his voice still placidly conversational. As Miss Petherbridge has noted, it was meticulously done. Not a rebellious splash, but a very precise rendering. Which brings us to the style of the spectacles themselves. That, I found, was the most curious detail of all. He took a sip of his own tea. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a large clock on the wall. They were not a modern design. They were not a caricature. They were a very specific type of old-fashioned wire-rimmed frame with those little circular pads for the bridge of the nose, almost a historical artifact in their own right. I confess, he added with a faint, self-deprecating smile, they reminded me of a photograph I have of my great-aunt Mildred. She was a librarian, wore a pair just like them until the day she died. He stopped speaking. He did not look at anyone in particular, his gaze directed at the center of the polished table. In the silence that followed, a complex series of almost invisible events took place. Mrs. Vance's teacup, which she had been holding in mid-air, was placed back in its saucer with a chink that was unnaturally loud. Alistair Finch opened his mouth to offer a learned opinion on 20th century optical fashions, then seemed to think better of it. Julian Vance was, for the first time, looking at the inspector with a flicker of genuine curiosity. But Purbright's attention was held by a movement from the fourth guest. The butler, Mr. Filbert, had entered the room a moment before, silently and on cue to collect the empty cups. He had been moving with the frictionless efficiency of his profession, but Upon hearing Purbright's description of the spectacles, his hands, which were about to lift the tray, became suddenly and completely still. It was a pause of less than a second, an infinitesimal hesitation in a lifetime of fluid, unobtrusive service. His gaze, usually fixed on a point of respectful middle distance, had sharpened, and in his eyes was the unmistakable glint of a vivid and long dormant memory. Pubright gave no sign that he had noticed. He cleared his throat gently. "Well," he said to the room at large, "food for thought. Thank you all for your invaluable insights." The meeting was over. The meeting dissolved with the quiet scraping of chairs and a general murmur of relief. To the attendees, it had been a quintessentially pointless civic exercise, and they were eager to return to their more pressing private affairs. They were gathering their coats and belongings when Inspector Purbright's calm voice cut gently through the air. "If I could just beg a moment more of your time. It seems I have been a poor host and allowed the tea to go cold." He gestured to the tray. "Mr. Filbert, perhaps you would be so good as to—" He let the sentence trail off. As Filbert moved to obey, Purbright added, almost as an afterthought, "Actually, Mr. Filbert, it is you I hope to have a final word with. Please, don't trouble yourself with the tray." The effect was immediate. Mrs. Vance, already halfway to the door, stopped and turned, her expression one of utter disbelief that a policeman would dare to detain her butler. The others paused, their departure arrested by a sudden, sharp spike of curiosity. Mr. Filbert himself simply stood by the tea tray, his posture unchanged, his face a mask of professional neutrality. But he did not move. "I believe we can bring this matter to a close now," Purbright said to the room at large. He looked at each of the nominal suspects in turn, his gaze mild but his meaning clear. "Mr. Vance," he began, "you were the obvious choice, an artist with a grudge. But this crime was not in your character. It was quiet, meticulous, and used the wrong sort of paint. It was an act of precision, not passion. You are therefore not our man." Julian offered a lazy, ironic salute. "Mr. Finch," Purbright continued, turning to the Historical Society chairman, "you covet the portrait for your museum. You believe it belongs to the public. But your goal is preservation. To deliberately alter the painting, however subtly, would be to damage the very asset you wish to acquire. It would be illogical. You are not our man either." Finch puffed out his chest slightly as if he had just been publicly exonerated of a crime he did not know he was suspected of. "And Miss Petherbridge, you saw the act for what it was, the work of a pedant, a quiet correction. And you certainly hold no great affection for Mrs. Vance's curation of her family's legacy. But your rivalry, I think, is a direct one, fought on the battleground of the annual flower show. This act was indirect, anonymous. It was not a challenge. It was a statement of fact. A statement, I suspect, with which you might even privately agree, but not one you would make yourself." Miss Petherbridge gave a small, sharp nod, a gesture of intellectual assent. "No," Purbright said, his voice dropping slightly. "The motive here was not anger, or ambition, or rivalry. It was, I believe, a form of loyalty, a deep and abiding loyalty to the truth of a person against the polish of their legend." He let his gaze finally rest on the still figure of the butler. "The crime required 3 things. First, the right materials. A common enamel paint, the kind a handyman might use for household repairs, for touching up a chipped picture frame or a scuff on a skirting board. A paint that was familiar, accessible, and permanent." He paused. Second, it required intimate access. The ability to move through Greystone Manor on a busy open day without attracting the slightest attention. The ability to enter the long gallery, spend a few minutes in front of the portrait, and leave, entirely unnoticed, because your presence there was the most natural thing in the world. "And third," Purbright said, his eyes now fixed on Filbert, "it required a specific and private piece of knowledge. This was the key. The spectacles were not a random design. They were a portrait in their own right. They were they not, Mr. Filbert, the very reading glasses that Lady Beatrice Greystone used every day in the last decade of her life? The silence in the room was now absolute. Mrs. Vance's face was a thundercloud of indignation. Lady Beatrice was known for her sharp eyes.
Her unyielding gaze, Pubright went on, his voice a calm river of logic.
It was central to her myth. But in her later years, her sight began to fail.
A small human frailty, but one she guarded fiercely.
A secret Mrs. Vance has, out of respect for her aunt's memory, continued to guard. But you knew Mr. Filbert? You served her for over 30 years. You would have brought her the Morning Post, and with it her spectacles.
You saw the woman, not the monument.
And you watched as the official memory, curated by Mrs. Vance, and embodied in that severe, unadorned portrait, erased the small truth you knew. It must have felt like a lie by omission, a final indignity to the person you had served so faithfully. So you took it upon yourself to correct the record. You bought a small tin of black enamel. On the day of the event, you simply walked into the gallery, and with a steady, practiced hand, you completed the portrait. You gave her back her spectacles. And later, you sent a donation to the Historical Society, clarifying your motive for anyone who cared to understand. You weren't mocking history. You were trying to make the town see it more clearly. Pubright fell silent. All eyes were on the butler. Mr. Filbert stood perfectly straight. The mask of professional deference was gone, replaced by a quiet, unassailable dignity. Her ladyship, he said, his voice clear and steady, disliked fuss. She also disliked falsehoods. The portrait in the gallery was becoming a falsehood. He looked directly at Mrs. Vance. Her memory is not so fragile as to be broken by a small truth, madam. Her strength was not in her eyes, but in her character. I felt the portrait ought to reflect the person, not just the reputation. Mrs. Vance made a small, strangled sound. It was the sound of a lifetime of carefully managed public perception collapsing in a dusty committee room. The spectacle of truth had proven to be infinitely more scandalous than the crime. The silence that followed Mr. Filbert's simple declaration was heavier and more profound than any that had preceded it. It was a silence composed of shattered propriety and the raw, awkward exposure of a long-held family secret. It was Mrs. Eleanor Vance who broke it, not with a word, but with an action. She rose to her feet, her movements stiff and deliberate. She did not look at her butler of 40 years. She did not look at the inspector. She looked at the far wall as if finding a sudden and intense interest in the portrait of a forgotten Victorian mayor. Then, with her dignity gathered around her like a shroud, she swept from the room. The closing of the heavy oak door behind her was not a slam, but a soft, final, and devastating click. The spell was broken. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, suddenly remembering a pressing engagement concerning moth damage in a collection of Boer War uniforms. Miss Petherbridge gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Inspector Pubright before taking her leave. Julian Vance, for his part, looked from the inspector to the butler with a newfound and entirely uncharacteristic expression of respect. "Well," he said, to no one in particular.
"I'll be damned." And then he too was gone. Pubright, Sergeant Love,
and Mr. Filbert were left alone in the room with the cooling tea and the weight of the revealed truth. "I assume," Pubright said to the butler, his voice returning to its normal placid tone, "that you have made arrangements?" "I have always maintained a small room in the town, sir," Filbert replied, "for my days off. I will remove my personal effects from the manor this evening. I believe my employment there is concluded." There was no trace of sadness or regret in his voice. It was a simple statement of fact. "And what will you do now?" A faint smile touched the butler's lips for the first time.
"I have a sister in Devon. Her garden is in a dreadful state."
"I imagine it will require a great deal of quiet correction." Sergeant Love, who had been struggling to fit the afternoon's events into any recognizable police procedure, finally found his voice.
"Sir, what are we charging him with?"
Pubright looked at Filbert, who waited patiently.
I don't believe Mrs. Vance will be pressing charges, Sergeant.
To do so would involve a public court case and the recitation of the very facts she has spent a lifetime concealing. Her pride will not allow it. The matter is, for all practical purposes, closed, and so it was. The truth of the affair seeped into Flaxborough's consciousness, not as a flood, but as a slow, permeating damp. The official version, relayed through Councillor Ormside, was that the matter had been resolved discreetly due to the delicate family nature of the incident. But the unofficial version, pieced together from whispers and deductions in the Chalice tea rooms, was far more satisfying. It was the butler. He had done it out of loyalty to the old lady, who was, it turned out, as blind as a bat in her later years. Within a week, life had resumed its normal, unhurried pace. Mr. Filbert was seen one Tuesday morning boarding the bus for Exeter, a single suitcase in his hand and an expression of quiet contentment on his face. Mrs. Vance, after a period of seclusion, reappeared in town to do her shopping, looking older perhaps, and a fraction less formidable. The following Sunday, the collection plate at St. Jude's was found to contain a single, anonymous envelope containing enough money to fix the entire western portion of the roof. At Greystone Manor, a quiet man in a van with a London telephone number came and went one afternoon. When he left, the portrait of Lady Beatrice Greystone was once again severe, perfect, and unadorned. The spectacles were gone, and yet they remained. For those who knew the story, it was impossible to look at the portrait now without seeing the faint, ghostly outline of a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, a small and permanent alteration to the town's perception of its own history. In his office, Inspector Pubright took the thin file that contained the entire affair.
On the cover he wrote the single word, closed.
Sergeant Love, beside him, was still wrestling with the absurd simplicity of it all. "All that work, sir?" he said, shaking his head.
All that bother just to put a pair of glasses on a painting. Pubright placed the file into its drawer.
"Not to put them on, Sergeant," he corrected gently, turning to the fresh new file on his desk, which concerned the theft of 3 prize-winning leeks from a local allotment.
To put them back.